All right, so I figured out one thing in life, if nothing else. If you do what you're supposed to do, from there you can pretty much get away with doing whatever it is that you want to do. Now, I recognize that's a dangerous thing to say doing this talk at a high school, so parents, I'm not telling your kids that they're basically, as long as they mop the floor, they can tear your house up. It's not that. But if you handle what you're responsible for, privileges tend to come after that. So I was toying around with this talk, and the title I ultimately came up with it was for the freedom of structure, because that's a lesson that I had to learn kind of the hard way across time. Now, in the last 15 years or so, I've done a bunch of different jobs, as many as you can imagine. I've worked as a music critic, I've worked covering sports, I've worked as a college professor, I have worked doing television, I've done podcasts, I've created YouTube videos, I've done all of those things, and the one thing that I had in common when I started doing all those things was that I had absolutely no idea what it was that I was doing when I started. That includes school, and I think that school is one of those things that you start and you go and you just kind of figure it out. And while I was doing school, or while I was in school, I figured out there was one thing I was good at with school, which was being smart. I could go as far as being smart was going to take me. If I walked in and I could figure some things out, then I could go. And that took me a long way. It took me through elementary school, it took me through middle school, it got me to high school, it took me to college, it took me through one master's degree, and then I worked on a PhD, and being smart all of a sudden wasn't good enough. It was really hard. And once it got to be really hard, I realized something. I didn't have a counterpunch. Like, once it got hard, all I could do was say, that's kind of difficult. And I could try to be as smart as I could, but I didn't have anything that was doing anything for me at those moments. I had nothing. And what I realized was I had no grounding. I didn't have any structure in the way that I went about doing anything, because my whole mentality on it was I could get in there and I could figure it out. And I could figure it out because I was smart. And then I was working on a PhD in economics, which required me to do three things. It required me to tighten up my work habits. It required me to change my thought process, because doing economics is completely different. And then it required me to do a whole lot of calculus. You can't do all three of those things at one time. Like, if you're trying to get a handle on what you got going, two of those at the most are what you could do. And then the microeconomics qualifying exam came around, and I didn't have it, and I was done, and they told me I had to go on about my business. Now, that was 10 years ago. And the three things that happened there worked out okay, ultimately. My work habits did improve. I learned a lot of economics. My thought process was a whole lot more structured, and by the time I was done, I didn't have to do calculus anymore. And I'll take not doing calculus anymore over having a PhD every day. The problem that came next, though, was what do you do with the rest of your life? And so I went full on into media. I'd been a freelance writer for years before, and I decided that that was the thing that I was going to do. And I had no idea what I was doing at that. So I'd sit at home, I'd come up with something, I'd write, I'd send it in, and somebody would tell me how great the thing was that I'd sent in. Well, that creates a bit of a problem, because now I think it doesn't matter that I don't know what I'm doing. If you were here for the first part of the speech, you realize that that caused me problems in the last place. But now I'm in this new one where I just convinced myself, I just didn't want to do economics, so that really wasn't such a big deal. Now I'm doing this, I like it, it doesn't matter that I don't know what I'm doing. And when you're a freelance writer, they never try to tell you really how to get better at it. It's a fling sort of relationship. They're not trying to build you into being a spouse. You're only going to be there once, and maybe you come back again. So then about a year later, I got a job. I was a full-time writer, and I had no idea what I was doing. And then I get into this, and now the expectations are different. Not only are they expecting me to know what I'm doing, they're expecting me to be able to tell them what it is that I'm doing. Everything is kind of flipped up, and I'm the guy who doesn't have a counterpunch. So I'm there, and I'm working. I'm trying to get better at being a writer, and I had a wonderful editor at that time whose name was Thomas Newman. And his job was basically to teach me how to become a better writer. So I'd come out of school realizing that I didn't have very much discipline. And then I came into this new thing I was doing, and I still didn't have very much discipline. In large part because I hated the way that the word discipline sounded. Like, even as I say the word discipline right now, I feel like I want to straighten up my back or go apologize or go sit in my room or something like that. Because the way I looked at myself was that discipline was the antithesis of creativity. That being disciplined was something that you told people to do because they couldn't figure out ways to do these things for themselves. And I'd always seen myself as being this creative person, when in reality I wasn't so much creative as much as it was that I was coasting. But I saw myself as creative, and in a way where I wasn't even able to understand the fact that I'd always been doing left brain activities. Like, I'm thinking myself as being a creative while I'm doing debate, or I'm thinking of myself as being a creative while I'm a chemistry major, or while I'm doing economics. All these places I'd seen myself as being wildly creative, so no one could tell me what to do, because you telling me what to do is stifling what I think made me good. It stifled what I thought was going to make me creative. And I realized at some point that I did not have any level of structure, and even worse than not having any level of structure, I didn't have the ability to accept structure, because I thought it was taking away from who I was. So you imagine I've got this full-time writing job, and now I'm going back and forth with this editor, and whenever I would write stuff, all I was doing was just sitting down and get on the keyboard, and I'd bang it out, and I'd read it, and I thought if it sounded good, I'd send it in, and I'd gotten all this positive reinforcement, and then one day I've got an editor who's asking me, okay, so you want to write something? I say, yeah. So I say, what do you want to write about? And I tell him a thing I wanted to write about. He's like, what do you want to say? And my response to that is, what do I want to say? I'm just going to go write it. Like, I'll write it, and then you'll get back what I say. And he says, okay, to me, well, what is your nut graph? I said, my what? He's like, well, I need a paragraph, just a paragraph to tell me what it is that you're going to talk about. And I'm thinking to myself, if all you need is a paragraph for me to tell you what I'm going to talk about, why am I wasting my time writing the rest of this? I can just give you a paragraph. And so he says, so what are you talking about? And I start realizing, as I'm talking to him, if you don't know what point it is that you're ultimately going to make, chances are that you don't have a point. And now that meant I had to learn to write. I had to learn all the things that everybody else had been doing, that me and my ego, I had convinced myself that I did not need to know how to do those things, that I was better if I did not know what I was doing. I was better off for that, because then I could come up with something fresh. It would be something that nobody had ever done before. Slowly but surely, in the hard way, I figured something out. Most of the times where everybody's been doing something forever, chances are there's a reason why they've been doing those things forever. Like, you're not going to be the guy to wake up and decide everything that everyone's been doing forever is ridiculous and the way that I do it is correct. However, picking up what everybody else was doing, it overloaded my brain. Like, as being a writer and the pressure of trying to keep my job on a one-year contract, and a one-year contract is not the place where you learn how you're doing what you're doing. But as I'm doing those things, I became a much better writer. Like, I learned how to make better points. I learned how to say things more quickly. I learned how to say things with more impact. And I also was scared to death every time I had to write, because I was overpowered by the idea that I had no idea what I was doing. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do what I'm doing while trying to figure out how to do that exceptionally well on a national platform. And it was too much. And even in a lot of ways to this day, it's a lot for me, because when I write, I get so caught up in whether or not I know what I'm doing. Like, I became the person that I feared that I was going to become, that creatively I would not be the guy that I once was. I would lose that because I was so caught up in trying to figure out what I was doing. But simultaneously, I had these two things going where I recognized that through limitations of my own, I wasn't as creative as I had been before. But I also recognized as I was doing it that I was getting better. Not good enough to keep my job, though. I got fired about a year later. And at that point, I think that was probably counting graduate school the third time that I had been fired. And I had this whole thing that had just really overloaded my mind, and I was trying to figure out what to do with, was the fact that I had always thought I was just smart enough to figure out everything it was that I was doing. And then once I wasn't smart enough, I didn't know what to do. And then I'm overloaded by the idea that maybe, just maybe, I'm not as smart as I thought I was. So I'm trying to figure out if I'm as smart as I thought I was while trying to prove how smart I am. And you can't win that way. And you wind up without a job. Now, luckily for me, being without a job then wound up coming to two jobs that in a lot of ways kind of saved my life in ways. I started doing a radio show, and I had a job as an adjunct professor. Two more things that I had no idea what to do. So I'm teaching a class in African American Studies, and I had previously taught economics, but that's not hard. They give you a textbook, it's got chapters, you decide what chapters you want to teach, and then you teach the class. Cool. At another class, now I'm teaching, it's called The Black Athlete in America. I'm teaching this at Duke, and I called my father, and my father's a professor, and he asked me, so, what's the class going to be about? And I say to him, the black athlete in America. Like, it's in the title. I don't really understand what this is that we need to discuss. And he said to me, well, there's got to be some direction. There's got to be some question. There's got to be some theoretical notion that you're trying to answer in the class. And he's telling me this 1 week before the syllabus is in. And I was like, whoa, okay, I don't know what I'm doing again. And then at the same time, I go and do radio, and I get there. And right at the time I got there, there was a consultant in place who was trying to teach a whole lot of people who've been doing radio forever better ways for them to do their jobs. So everybody else there is resisting what he's talking about, but I'm there at the radio station, and they told me it was almost like Coming to America, where you start off washing lettuce, and then one day they'll put you on the grill. They said, you're doing a Saturday show, and if you do this well, then this summer, you'll be hosting in the afternoon drive. Well, I didn't have a job for the summer. So if listening to this man was how I was going to have a job for the summer, then I was going to wind up listening to this man. And I was almost rigid about it. And what he taught me was how to get into commercial breaks, how to get things out, how to get people to listen to a segment, and when it was over, stay on and listen to the next segment. What he was gradually telling me was how to make a radio show that people would continue to listen to. And I had no choice but to listen to him. And so I did that. And so I started doing radio. And in the course of doing that, I started realizing that all these things that I thought were going to stop me from being creative were actually the things that unlocked my ability to be creative. Because it's hard to think about what you're saying if you're overloaded with thinking about how to say it. So for the first time in my life, I had gone into a project with the goal of developing the habits that I needed to have, with the goal of having the structure that I needed to have in order to do it right. And then once I had the structure in place, now I'm going in and I'm asking questions. It's no longer a matter of I'm going to start doing this and figure out what it is later. I was walking in with the question of how do I want this radio segment to feel? What do I want people to think about when I talk? Where do I want to go with this? And these are all things that I just seen as tasks that I had to do that were mundane and troublesome. But suddenly I got into it and I realized something. These were the things that I was supposed to do. And once I got a handle on the things that I was supposed to do, I now could do everything in the world that I wanted to do. So I had all these structures in place that I had to create a technically strong segment, and I realized something my dad had told me a long time ago, which was, let the tool do the work for you. You don't grab a screwdriver by the end with the Phillips head on it. You grab it at the back and you let the tool do the work for you. And everything that I thought that all these people were doing who were very organized was because they had to. Maybe they didn't have to. Maybe this was just unlocking the capabilities that they had, and I'd always thought I was just so capable that there was nothing to unlock. But for the first time in my life, I had really gone about understanding that I needed an approach. I needed a structure behind what I was doing. And every piece of work that I did after that got better. In the class I was teaching, once I had a structure for what the course was, I could go in there and talk about whatever I wanted. Being a professor is the closest thing to being a dictator that you're going to find in common life. I could go in there and talk about anything that I wanted because they knew ultimately where it was that we were supposed to go. And I realized something that I had missed in all those times where everybody else was doing what they were supposed to do and I was coming in later. They weren't making their lives harder. They were actually making their lives so much easier. Because once you had that grasp of what was important and what you must do, what you wanted to do became wide open, and you could figure out how to actually do what you wanted to do. And then once you figured out what you could do, what you wanted to do, people might actually consume it. All the things that they were trying to teach me to do in writing were things to make it easier for people to appreciate what I was doing. All the things that I was learning to do in radio were making it easier for people to consume the product that I was giving. So it went from just being a creative person, but to being someone that people would actually hear. And it made me think about something that I learned. I did an interview with Aaron Magruder one year where he kept saying that I'm just a cartoonist, but he would always talk about the more that other people should do and they should be more socially active and everything else. And I asked him, but you say that you're just a cartoonist, and he told me, yes, I'm just a cartoonist, and that means that my job is to be funny. And once I'm funny, I can do everything else. But the last thing I want to be is one of those underground rappers who's talking about how good his stuff is, but nobody ever hears it. Magruder figured out early that once you did what you had to do, he was wide open to do everything else that he wanted to do. So you could be the wildly creative person that operates in his own space and doesn't do anything that's according to convention. Or you could be the sort of guy that operates like the Beatles operate, or the sort of guy that operates like Outkast does. And that's somebody who figures out what the structure is that is necessary to do something that people can consume, and then the wild range of creativity that you still have left. All the things that people tell you that you have to do, not all of them are correct. But most of them are things that you need to keep in mind. And most of them are things that you need to remember. And once you have those things in mind, you realize the tools that are behind you is not something that your teachers or your professors or your bosses told you because you had to do it. It's something they're telling you because it's going to make you better at what you do. It's something that's going to unlock what is inside of you. And the last thing that you can wind up doing is winding up in a situation where the ego that you have trumps the capabilities that you've got. Not everybody out there is a sheep, you know? Not everybody's out there just following behind what they've been told to do. A lot of those people have figured out what people like me figured out the hard way. Do what you're supposed to do, and then you'll be free to do everything else that you want to do. Thank you.